Hi, everyone. Okay, so this is our second to last lecture. We'll do a couple more Zoom meetings to talk about various things, including the optional exam. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about functional explanations. Okay, so a little bit of preamble, and then we'll get into functions. So if you remember, we were talking about explanations in general several weeks ago. So we looked at, for example, the deductive nomological account of explanations, where the whole idea was something counts as a good explanation, a good scientific explanation, if you deduce the thing to be explained from some law of nature and some specific facts. So this is an old attempt at trying to understand explanation. We saw a couple of objections to it. So, for example, that the deductive nomological account couldn't distinguish, for example, between predictions and explanations. So, the sun's position explains the shadow, but the shadow doesn't explain the sun's position, even though you can predict the sun's position if you know the length of the shadow and the height of the flagpole. So there's this asymmetry between explanation and prediction, and the deductive nomological account didn't seem to capture it. So one of the solutions to the problem was to add in causes. So the deductive nomological account nowhere says that the law that you have to cite is causal. It just has to be universal and non-specific. So it can't mention any sort of specific people, places, or things, and it has to apply to everything in the universe. But it doesn't say that it has to cite the causes of the event. So one way of getting around this issue, people, after the kind of critique of the deductive nomological account, people started to think that the main thing that an explanation needs to do is cite the kind of mechanical causes, the things that pushed and pulled the situation into being what it is. A causal force that literally kind of moves the system in some important way. So we looked at a little bit about causes, we looked a little bit about causal explanation, and then when we started talking about philosophy of biology, another kind of explanation cropped up, and we weren't sure exactly what to do with it. So sometimes it looks like what we're not doing is citing the causes of a thing to explain it. What we do is cite the goals of a thing to explain it. So this is perfectly okay with, everybody agrees that this is an okay thing to do if you're trying to explain something that a person made. So for example, a hammer. So if I want to say, well, why does a hammer have this hard metal bit on one end and a long handle on the other end? Well, the explanation for that is because somebody was making a hammer with the goal of it being useful for hitting things. So the goal in the mind of the creator is part of the explanation for why the hammer is the way that it is. So there are a whole lot of these sort of goal-based explanations that have the form, why is it this way? It's because it's for striking nails or whatever specific thing you're talking about. As I said, with artifacts, with things that humans made, artifacts just in the sense of like a thing that we built on purpose, that seems perfectly fine because there's a good story about how the goal gets translated into the reality, right? So somebody made the hammer on purpose. They had a thought that I wish I had something to hit these nails with, and then they went about and designed a hammer and made it. But we also use functional explanations in other places. So what are my hands for? And people very often in sort of normal situations are happy to apply functional explanations to things that aren't artifacts, to things that are natural. So you could say my hands are for manipulating objects. Now, if you believe in a creator God who designed us the way we design hammers, that's perfectly okay too, because there's a goal in somebody's mind, God's, that results in us having hands that look like the way we are. But supposing that we're trying to explain the world scientifically without helping ourselves to the hypothesis that there's a God, that's not an option. And so we don't have somebody we can sort of cite and say, they made our hands on purpose. Nonetheless, it seems kind of reasonable to say that my hands are for manipulating things, or my eyes are for seeing, ears are for hearing. These functional descriptions seem pretty reasonable, and they do seem to explain a lot, right? So if we're thinking about which explanations are good ones, functional explanations seem like pretty good explanations. And then the question is, what do we do with these things? So for a long time, functional explanations were in some sense banished from the scientific worldview, partly because what people wanted to banish was the notion of a divine order that's used to explain things. So for a lot of cultures and a lot of parts of the world, for a lot of history, the universe, the inorganic universe itself, was regarded as having been designed, having been made with a purpose in mind. So there's God's plan or something like that. This is an image of, you can't really see it, but it's an image of what was called the Great Chain of Being in medieval or European history. So the idea was that there's plants at the very bottom of the chain of being, and then animals, and then people, and then rich people, and then angels, and then God. So the king, the divine plan is that the king stands above everybody, and then it was medieval Europe, so men stand above women, and women above animals, sort of thing. So there's been a very strong tendency in the history of thinking about the world to ascribe a divine plan to things, to try to understand the world in terms of the intentions of its creator. We might call it the divine order. And it's not just Europe. I mean, lots of cultures have thought this way. So to try to get a scientific grip on the world, to try to come up with explanations that are, in some sense, naturalistic, we might say. So a naturalistic explanation is one that doesn't cite sort of the divine plan for the universe. To come up with naturalistic explanations, you can't let yourself do this divine order stuff. Basically, we have to come up with ways of describing and understanding the world that don't assume that there's a planner, that just try to explain things in naturalistic terms. And you might get to the point in this project where you can't explain anymore. So maybe you get to the point where you're asking, like, why was there a big bang in the first place? Maybe that's a point where it becomes reasonable to say, well, we don't know. And there you could, take up your sort of religious hypothesis as a potential explanation. But if we're doing science, the sciencey bits have to be naturalistic, which is to say we're not allowed to sort of help ourselves to the God hypothesis. Because if you allow yourself to do that in science, you can explain anything. Why are there rainbows? Well, God. Why does it snow when it's cold? That's probably God too. On and on. Like, you can just explain it. It's too powerful of a hypothesis. You can explain everything. And just historically speaking, when people started trying to explain things without using this kind of divine purpose style explanations, they got a lot further in their projects. So it really paid off as a strategy to try to stop doing these functional explanations for natural objects. So for things like the weather, or the structure of the world, or why there are animals in the first place, or for large scale structures of questions about the structure of reality, giving up on functional explanations seems like it paid off big time. However, for talking about especially the parts of living things, so it might not be reasonable to ask what the function of lizards are. It might not be reasonable to ask what the function of plants in general are. But you can it has never stopped being the case that biologists have used functional language to describe especially the parts of living things. So lungs are for breathing. They're for exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. Hearts are for pumping blood. Kidneys are for filtering the blood. These seem like really useful explanations. So the discovery that hearts pump blood was one of the things that kicks off the kind of the Renaissance. We didn't understand what it was for a very long time. Getting that kind of breakthrough in anatomy was a huge step. And what we discovered was, in some sense, the function of the heart. So certainly the practice of biologists and practice of people who study living things in general has been to use functional explanations. And furthermore, they seem like important scientific knowledge. If you don't know that the heart is for pumping blood, you've missed something crucial, right? Like you need that knowledge to understand what's going on in the body. Just in the same way that you need to know what a hammer is for if you want to understand hammers. So there's this kind of challenging tension that we face. So giving up on functional explanations in, physics and astronomy and chemistry and all that stuff looked like it was a really good strategy. Like we made a huge amount of progress because we didn't let ourselves, talk about a divine plan anymore. But for living things, and especially for the parts of living things, functional explanations look in some sense indispensable. We can't really do without them. So what do we do with these things? That's the topic of today. So the topic of today is, what do we do with functional explanations? In some sense, they look when applied to anything except for artifacts, for which we know that there was somebody with an actual goal in their minds who tried to make it that way. For anything except that, functional explanations look a bit suspicious. And yet they're incredibly powerful, they're incredibly useful, and they look indispensable. That's the trick. They look like you can't do without them. And certainly biology has never managed to do without them. Biology has always been full of functional explanations. So, what do we do with these things? What do you do with the very concept of a function? Right? So that's our project today. We're going to go through this reading, this chapter on function by D.M. Walsh. And the question of that chapter is function a respectable scientific concept that we should try to get, or is it something that we should, in some sense, try to get rid of? So everybody agrees, as far as I can tell, that these functional descriptions, like the lungs are for exchanging air, are pretty useful. So what's not on the table is the option of just saying, forget it, we're not even going to talk about these things anymore. We're just going to dump all of that as nonsense. That doesn't seem to be like an option on the table. What might be an option is giving what we might call a reductive account of functions. So a reductive account is, in general, it is where you try to take a concept and re-explain it using other concepts that don't invoke the original concept. So just an example will probably make this clearer. Take my favorite example, lightning. So lightning, we used to think it was, but people used to think it was, thunderbolts. Thunderbolts from gods, right? Like it was Zeus or Thor or somebody like that hurling these sort of divine things down to the earth. We since have figured out that these things are just electrical phenomena, which means that ultimately lightning is just the movement of electrons. And anything that you wanted to say in terms of lightning could be redescribed in terms of electrons moving around, in the atmosphere and on the ground. So the transfer of electrons from one place to another. So there's nothing over and above that to lightning, right? There's nothing else that you want to say about lightning. Everything you want to explain about lightning, you can explain in terms of electrons moving around. So the concept of lightning is reducible to the concept of electrons moving. And a lot of people have thought that the right thing to do with so the idea of function is to reduce it to something else. So if we've got these functional explanations, they look really good, they look really useful, so we can't really just chuck them out. Just like you wouldn't want to chuck out the idea of lightning, right? We need to understand what this, light and noise come crashing down from the sky and vaporize a tree once in a while. You can't just do without that concept. Like, maybe you could do without the concept of ghosts or spirits or whatever. Those are concepts that maybe you can just sort of dump. But lightning is clearly a real thing. It's an important concept to have, but we want to be able to explain it in terms of simpler things that we can understand more clearly, more distinctly. And the question for us today is, can we or should we do something similar with functions? Something where we translate these ideas into other ideas, translate the idea of having a function into other ideas that fit better into the, let's say, scientific worldview, right? So that fit better into the what some people call naturalistic worldview. So that's the question. Okay, so for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to go through two broad categories of attempts to understand or analyze the accounts of function. So first we're going to do what we call reductive, non-teleological accounts. So we unpack that a little. It's reductive because what it tries to do is take the idea of function and turn it into something that doesn't involve goals. So to say something is teleological is to say that it's goal-based. The telos of something is its goal. Now, clearly we have goals for artifacts, so things like hammers. The idea of, the goal of a hammer is to be good at hitting nails or whatever. And so these are, you might want to, you're tempted to say that the goal of a heart is pumping blood, but the question is, does the heart really have a goal, a real goal? Goals seem like the kind of thing that you need to have a mind in order to have. Hearts don't really have minds as far as anybody can tell. So we're going to look at a few reductive accounts that try to take this goal-based language right out of our concept of function. So find a way of re-describing functions without invoking goals in any sort of substantial sense. So we'll look at these reductive non-teleological accounts, and then we'll look at one or two teleological non-reductive accounts where we just sort of accept the idea that there are goals in the system and don't try to reduce that away. So two broad strategies for dealing with the concept of function. Okay, so we'll look at Wright's 1973 account of function. It goes something like this. So I'll quote right from the Walsh paper. So the function of x is z means, so we're translating the sentence, the function of x is z, into the following two things, which are pretty similar, but one, x is there because it does z, and two, z is a consequence or a result of x's being there. Okay, so let's do an example to make that clearer. So the steering wheel is there because it directs the car. And the car changing direction is a result of the car having a steering wheel and having somebody move the steering wheel. So the function, therefore, the steering wheel is for making your car go where you want it to go. So this is an account of function where the first condition says the existence of the thing is due to the fact that it has this effect, and the effect is a result of the thing being there. That's the second condition. So if something meets both of those conditions, Wright says, then that's its function. So we can do this with biological things too. So that was a nice, this was a nice artifact. So we know it's got a function. It should work for any account of function should work perfectly well for artifacts. It should also work, hopefully, for non-artifacts. So let's try this. Try the same thing, just filling it out with eyes. So eyes are there because they help animals to see, and animals see because they have eyes. Therefore, on Wright's account, eyes are for seeing. That sounds okay, right? So the second one should be pretty uncontroversial, right? You don't have eyes, you can't see. That's pretty much a gimme. The first one takes a little bit of unpacking, but Wright hopes that you can do that, you can make that true because eyes were selected for seeing, right? So they evolved because they help animals to see. So you can make this a little more specific. So in 1991, Karen Neander wrote a paper where she argued that we should get evolution into this story. So the function of a trait is just any feature of an organism, like having eyes. So the function of a trait is what that trait was selected for by evolution. So eyes were selected for providing vision. So the function of eyes is to provide vision. So here, being selected for just means that animals with better eyes, or eyes that are more suited to their lifestyle in some sense, did better in terms of surviving and reproducing, or helping their close relatives reproduce. And that kind of causal connection between eyes and seeing, and then therefore surviving and reproducing, is what kind of produced and maintained eyes as we understand them. So that's the sense in which eyes were selected for seeing. That is, seeing helped these animals survive and reproduce. And that's why it makes sense. So when we say the function of eyes is for seeing, Neander says we can redescribe that. So we're reducing this. We take this sentence about the function of eyes, say they're for seeing. We can get some redescription of that doesn't involve talking about functions, and it doesn't involve, crucially, it doesn't involve talking about goals, right? So when I say eyes help an animal to see, or that eyes were selected for seeing, what I'm really saying is those animals that have eyes are more likely to survive and reproduce. So those animals that have eyes that let them see have been more likely to survive and reproduce than animals that didn't have functional eyes. So that's the redescription of this. And notice that description I just gave you, so more likely to survive and reproduce, doesn't say anything about goals. Right? So the hope is that what we've given is a way of redescribing this functional language in non-functional, non-teleological language. Okay. So this has got a couple of advantages. So when we're trying to do this reduction, okay, so the project here is we're trying to reduce the concept of function to non-functional language, to non-teleological language. And when you're trying to reduce a concept, one of the tests to see whether you've done it well or done it poorly is, does it capture the things that were important about the original language? So I'm trying to reduce functional talk to non-functional talk. My attempt at reduction should retain the important and interesting parts of the original functional language. So if you just sort of leave out a whole bunch of stuff that was useful and interesting about functions, then your reduction hasn't really succeeded, right? So when we talked about lightning, the idea was, talking about electrons moving gets us everything that was important and interesting about lightning. And if you can't, we used to think it was sort of divine in some sense. It turns out that that's not an important part of the story about lightning. So we can leave those parts out. But everything that was interesting and important about lightning gets redescribed, right? It makes it over into the reduced description. So when we're doing functions, we want to test to make sure that our reduced functional language, so the non-functional language that we're reducing our functional language to, should keep all the important bits of the functional language. So here's some advantages. So here's some things about the selected effects account that seem to be good in that sense. It lets us still talk about function and malfunction. So we usually want to distinguish between something doing its job and not doing its job. So if eyes are selected for vision, then if they don't provide vision, then they are in some sense malfunction. So picture of normal vision versus astigmatism. I got a little astigmatism myself, so my eyes are not performing their function perfectly unless I put on my glasses, which corrects for them. So because selected effects tells us about what helps animals survive and reproduce, we can meaningfully continue to talk about functions versus malfunctions. So keep this in mind later, because another account is not going to do as well on this score. Similarly, it helps us talk about functions and accidents. So here's another distinction when we're talking about functions that we want to kind of keep clear. We want to retain this, and in however we translate our functional talk, we want to retain the distinction between something being a function and being an accident. So the heart is for pumping blood, right? That's its job. If it fails to pump blood, then it's misfunctioning, so that's fine. The heart also makes thump-thump noises, right? It makes a little sound. You can listen to it with a stethoscope. So but that's not what hearts were selected for, right? As far as anybody can tell, the little noise that a heart makes doesn't really contribute to your survival or reproduction particularly. There's no clear sense in which your survival and reproduction, or the reproduction of your close relatives, that is, your ability to get your genes into the next generation, doesn't really seem to hang all that much on, or at all, as far as anybody can tell, the fact that it makes a thump-thump noise, right? So on the selected effects account of function, the function of the heart is pumping blood, because that has a lot to do with whether you're going to survive, right? Your heart's not pumping blood, you're not doing well. Whereas if your heart, for some magical reason, stopped making thump-thump noises, you'd probably be fine, right? Certainly, I mean, now that we've got stethoscopes, maybe you need it sort of for the doctor to diagnose you or something like that. But especially in the context in which we evolved. So the selected effects account focuses on the evolutionary history of the trait. It's not necessarily what's happening right now. It's where did this come from in terms of the long, slow evolution of the trait. So in the long, slow evolution of hearts, making thump-thump noises kind of wasn't that, as far as anybody knows, it really wasn't important, right? That's not what it was selected for. It's an accident. It's a sort of, it's not that it's an error accident, but it's just sort of a coincidence or something like that the heart makes these noises. So the selected effects account helps us retain this distinction between the job of the heart and things that it just kind of happens to do. The job of the heart, its function, is pumping blood. And by that we mean, on the selected effects account, what we mean is it was selected for pumping blood. Hearts that pump blood well helped you survive and reproduce. Hearts that didn't pump blood well didn't help you survive and reproduce. So selection is sort of weeding out those hearts that don't do the job well. It's not weeding out hearts that don't make thump-thump noises. There doesn't seem to be any selection for or against that at all. So again, this is a good thing for the selected effects account of function. That's a pretty good thing, right? It's doing what we want a reductive account to do, which is to retain the important and interesting features of the original language. So far we've seen that it's able to retain the function-malfunction distinction and the function-accident distinction. So that's pretty good. Okay. So now let's look at some problems for selected effects. So, as I just said, I mean, to explain the function-accident distinction, it was important to note that things can change in their sort of relevance for survival and reproduction, for fitness, we might say. Evolution in general really doesn't seem to care what the function of something used to be. So evolution doesn't just say, okay, the function of a hand is for gripping trees. So our hands used to be for mostly gripping things, right? And that was true for millions of years. Hands are for gripping, pushing, pulling, that sort of stuff. But we've repurposed our hands, for example, for typing. It's not something that evolution previously had to factor in. So it does seem reasonable to me to say that my hands have acquired, amongst their many functions, one of their functions now is, and this is, for an academic, typing is like, that's how I survive, right? This is how I make my daily bread, is typing things. But evolution hasn't had time to select for that. The length of time that keyboards have existed is very small compared to the scale of time required for evolution. So if the function of my hands includes typing things, but on the selected effect account, typing isn't one of the functions of my hands, that seems weird and sort of unfortunate for the account, right? Because it's not just modern stuff like typing. Evolution is very good at taking something whose job used to be something else and repurposing it. So our appendixes used to be for, I don't remember what they used to be for. When we used to eat like much rougher food, like bark and stuff, I don't know, whatever. The appendix had a different function than it does now. For most of the 20th century, for most of my life, it was understood the appendix has no function now. Turns out it's still got a function. So it's sort of acquired this new function, which is to be a hideout for bacteria. Turns out your stomach needs a whole bunch of bacteria to do your intestinal tract particularly needs a whole bunch of bacteria to do its job well. So we live in this kind of symbiotic relationship with bacteria. And one of the major health hazards humans have faced throughout history is diarrhea. We have severe diarrhea, still kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. So when you have diarrhea, all your bacteria get washed out, and the appendix turns out to be a really good place for them to hide out. So when you're having a bout of diarrhea, everything's getting washed out, and then there's this little hang-on bit, the appendix, that's not getting washed out, where a little colony of bacteria can survive and stay in you. And then once you're over it, they kind of emerge from the appendix and recolonize your stomach so you can digest things in a proper way. So evolution is doing this stuff all the time. Things get as the environment changes, and the environment can change very quickly. Evolution is really good, and it does this all the time, of repurposing things that were selected for something else, right? So there's a long, long history of selection for a trait for one function, and then the environment changes, and suddenly this trait has a new function, in the sense that it's doing so, it's helping the animals survive in a new way. It plays a new role in their life. They use it for new goals, just like we suddenly figured out that we could type with our fingers. But it doesn't have the history that the selected effects account crucially ties to calling something a function. So for the selected effects account, something has to have this long history of selection for a purpose in order for that to count as its function. But it looks very reasonable to say something can acquire a new function very quickly, right? It can very quickly have a new function, even if it doesn't have this long history of selection for that function. Evolution is very creative. It's very able to repurpose and readapt things in new circumstances. That's one of the reasons that living things are as successful as we are. But that means that things only get to be a function if they've been around for a long time. And that seems weird. That seems to be a tension between the way that we use functional language and the reduction being offered by the selected effects account. So we're happy to use functional language for things like fingers are for typing, or appendixes are for harboring bacteria, even if those are new, unselected for, like selection hasn't had time yet to act on those things. Maybe if you left it for another 100,000 years, it would have time to act on those things. But currently, evolution hasn't had time to act on our finger typing function. So on the selected effects account, that's not a function. But maybe it should be. It sounds like intuitively it seems like it should be. This seems like something that we are able to do, some interesting, important work with functional language that's not being captured by the selected effects account. And if that's right, then it's not as good of a reduction as we might have hoped. Another issue, another question for the selected effects account is that something has to be selected for in order for it to be a function. But sometimes it looks like something's got a function while it's being maybe not selected for or even selected against. So a tragic example, I take it that the function, so deers when they're confronted by danger freeze. A lot of sort of herbivores do this, right? If you don't have good sharp claws or powerful defenses of other types, it's often a good idea to just stay very still when you're confronted with danger, and then run away when you see a chance. So the function, deer have this instinct built into them. Something dangerous approaches, you freeze, and that what that was selected for in the past was avoiding predators. But now there are cars, and a deer freezing in the headlights of a car is a really bad survival strategy. Now, I don't know whether it's worse, you're worse off as a deer having this freeze response or not having it. Maybe it saves them from enough predators still that the cost of some deer being hit by cars is being outweighed. But you can certainly imagine a scenario where there's so many cars and so few predators that having the freeze response is actually bad for the deer in terms of their fitness, in terms of their ability to survive and reproduce. And in that case, we would have to say, because it's being selected against, we would have to say that freezing doesn't have the function of avoiding predators. But it seems like it still does, right? That's what it's for. The freezing instinct is for avoiding predators, even if it's not helping them overall, even if it's being selected against because the environment's changed somehow, like cars exist now. That's still what that instinct is for. Now, the selected effects account says something is only a function if it's being selected for that function, or something's only a function if it's being selected for. Whereas it seems like something can still be, this example is meant to show, something can still be a function even if it's being selected against. So, once again, there seems to be some conflict between our intuitive notion of function, the usefulness of the language of functions, that's not being captured by the selected effects account. So that's another issue, another sort of incomplete reduction. Okay. So that was selected effects. Let's look at another reductive non-teleological account of functions. So this is Cummins 1975. This one's really stripped down. It's a really, really simple and very permissive notion of functions. So Cummins says the function of a thing is just the causal contribution that it makes to some system of interest. So whatever the trait, so let's talk about traits still, whatever the trait does, just whatever it does, that's its function. So just any causal contribution to a system. Now, it doesn't have to be a causal contribution that it, in this case, so notice that it's not like the selective effects account. So selective effects says it's got to be a causal contribution that made a difference to survival and reproduction. And that was part of what made the selective effects account good. It's part of the liabilities of the account. Cummins says, no, we're not doing any of that. We're just saying whatever causal contribution it makes, that's what its functions. So the heart has, in a lot of cases this works fine. The heart has the causal role of pumping blood around the body. Therefore, that's its function. And to go back to another example, the heart also makes thumping noises, which is a causal role that it plays. It's a thing that it does. So a causal role is just thing that it does. So the heart makes thump noises. If Cummins' account of function is just whatever causal role something plays is its function, or whatever its functions, plural, are whatever causal roles it has, then making thump noises is part of the function of the heart. So that's weird. Right? It's odd, especially in the sense that it seems to apply functional language too broadly. It seems to say too many things are functions. And thinking back on the benefits of the selected effects account, this doesn't let us do a couple of things that we thought were good about the previous account. So the selected effects account looked good because it helped us do things like distinguish functions and malfunctions, or functions and accidents. So if you have a heart attack and your heart starts going into crazy arrhythmia, that's a causal role that it plays. And so at that moment, the function of your heart is to have a heart attack. So that's the function malfunction. So I have astigmatism. The function of my eyes is to produce little halos around things when I haven't got my glasses on. That's what they do. So when we decouple functional language from the contribution to fitness or something like that, we get rid of some of the problems with the selected effects account, but we lose some of the advantages. So we are no longer able to distinguish functions from malfunctions. Whatever something does, that's one of its functions. We also lose the ability to distinguish between functions and accidents, those things that a thing does as part of its job, and those things that it does just by coincidence. So making thump noises, that's a function of the heart. Occasionally having heart attacks, that's also a function of the heart on Cummins' account. So it's not... If you care about those distinctions, if you think those distinctions are important parts of our functional language, you probably don't want to subscribe to the Cummins role, causal role functions of Cummins. Okay. So, those are a couple of reductive, non-teleological accounts trying to get rid of the goal-based talk. Let's switch now to the other major type of approach to functions. So, non-reductive teleological accounts. So the thing here is we're going to not try to get rid of this goal talk. So the reason why you would want to do a reductive account is you find goals to be, especially in anything except like a mind like ours that can represent a goal to itself, you might find goal talk kind of suspicious. It certainly was suspicious to people who did, scientific revolution science. They wanted to get rid of the kind of Aristotelian picture of the world where goals were everywhere. They wanted to explain just in terms of mechanical pushing and pulling forces. One way of dealing with functional talk is to say, no, actually we're going to allow goals into the scientific worldview. We're going to take goals to be something that are naturalistically acceptable. And then when we're trying to understand functional talk, we understand it in terms of the trait's contribution to the goal of some organism. So we're going to take goals to be real features of living things. We're not going to try to reduce them away. So this is non-reductive in the sense that we're not trying to get rid of goals. It's teleological in the sense that it's goal-based explanations of what functions are. So if we're allowed to say the function of something is how it contributes to the goals of an organism, then we get back a lot of the stuff that was good about the selected effects account. So we get back the function-accident distinction. So hearts, the goal of a heart is pumping blood, and that's its function. The goal of a heart is not to make thump noises. That's just something it happens to do. So good. The goal of lungs is exchanging air with the atmosphere, and we can say that they're functioning well when they do that. They're functioning badly when they don't do that. So we also get the function, by allowing ourselves to talk about the goals of organisms, we get back the function-malfunction distinction. The disadvantage, of course, is that it relies on goals, which are, a lot of people don't think we should allow ourselves to talk about goals except in the context of intelligent beings who can represent things to themselves. Clearly, the heart does not have represented to itself the goal of pumping blood. Your lungs don't know that they're for exchanging oxygen. So we need to come up with some way of thinking about goals that are okay if we're going to do these teleological accounts of function. Okay, so just want to remind you of this stuff that we talked about a little bit with philosophy of biology. This was from Kant's critique of judgment, and this was, Kant's argument here was you can't have a science of biology. The conclusion was you can't have a science of biology, and the argument was that you can't understand living things unless you understand them in terms of their goals. You need to. So why do birds have hollow bones? It's a question about just the mechanical construction of bird bodies, and we know that there's no mechanical reason why that has to be so, because we've got solid bones. There's lots of animals with solid bones. Not all animals have hollow bones. So Kant argued that if you want to understand this, it's a contingent fact about birds. That is, that didn't have to be that way. If you want to understand this contingent fact, you need to understand the goals of the bird. You need to understand that it wants to fly around, that it's trying to fly around, that it's that the overall lifestyle of a bird involves flying around. And that's what explains why they've got hollow bones. But if you think everything needs to be explained in terms of mechanisms and never in terms of goals, this just gets things absolutely backwards. Kant's argument went, to summarize it very briefly, Kant's argument went like this. Living things are self-organized, which is to say, the parts exist for the sake of the whole, and the whole exists for the sake of the parts. Right? So the leaves exist to collect sunlight and to exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide. Their goal is to support the growth of the tree, and the growth of the tree is to support, at least in part, the growth of its part. The growth of the tree is to support the growth of its parts. So both top-down and bottom-up explanations, or understanding why the parts are there, understanding why the whole is there, seems to involve goal-based explanations, and it seems to involve this sort of like cycle, the circle of explanation. So, and as we talked about earlier, we talked about the mechanical philosophy, circular explanations are supposed to be bad, right? You're not supposed to be allowed to use these circular explanations. Therefore, he concludes, there can never be a science of living things, because you need these circular explanations. You need to cite the goals of both the parts and the whole, and their mutual sort of like goal-based interactions. And you're not allowed to do that according to science. Therefore, we can't understand living things. So, the point where we might want to get off the train here, so at the end of the chapter that I asked you to read, Walsh starts questioning premise 3. That is, can we have respectable scientific explanations that involve parts and wholes each kind of co-constructing each other? And he argues that, yeah, actually we can. So innovations in the 20th and 21st century showed how it doesn't land us in circular explanations. Even if the causes are circular, in the sense that the parts are causing the whole and the whole is causing the parts, that doesn't end up in just the utterly vacuous circular explanations that we were so worried about in the scientific revolution. So the example I used last time of circular explanation was from Moliere. Why does opium make you sleepy? Because it has a dormitive virtue. Dormitive virtue just means it makes you sleepy. So that means that you've explained why it makes you sleepy in terms of it making you sleepy. So that's a circular explanation. That's really bad. We don't want to go there. The problem with Kant's argument is probably premise 3, where we say, just because the parts are causing the whole and the whole is causing the parts doesn't mean that we've got into this kind of vicious circular explanation. Okay. So Here's an example of this. So here's Stuart Kauffman, who tried to think about self-organization in living things, and his example is an autocatalytic set. So let me just read this. So Immanuel Kant saw organisms as wholes. The whole existed by means of the parts. The parts existed because of and to sustain, there's that functional language, for the purpose of sustaining the whole. This holism has been stripped of a natural role in biology, replaced with the image of the genome as the central directing agency that commands the molecular dance. Yet an autocatalytic set of molecules is perhaps the simplest image one can have of Kant's holism. Okay, so what was all that, and what is an autocatalytic set of molecules? Okay, so here's a really the simplest possible autocatalytic set. So we've got here chemicals A and B. So suppose that molecule AB catalyzes, that is, helps to create the formation of molecule BA, and molecule BA helps to catalyze the formulation of molecule AB. So in this context, what we have is some parts generating each other, right? BA is making AB, and AB is making BA. And what Kauffman is arguing is that this is the simplest possible version of what Kant said living things are like. That is, this overall autocatalytic network or autocatalytic set, which of course you can imagine being much, much more complex. In living things, there's all kinds of these autocatalytic sets, and they make these very complex networks of parts making other parts, which ultimately make the first part. So, for example, my lungs help to bring in oxygen. That oxygen is used by my liver cells to help digest food. The digested food is used by my other cells to make like my kidneys. My kidneys help to clarify my blood, which helps to make my lungs, which helps to, and so we go in this big circle. So all the parts are helping to construct each other in this kind of circular network of mutual production. And if you needed a description of a living thing, that's not bad, right? If you wanted to say what a living thing is, a network of parts that make other parts that help make the first part, in a way where the overall structure helps to sort of. So what this is missing is that it's supposed to be adaptive. So more complex versions of this. So this is the simplest possible autocatalytic set, but in a living thing, what we do is regulate the way the parts make each other in such a way to keep the whole thing going. So this is the holism that Kauffman thinks Kant was sort of baffled by. But now we have reasonably good models to describe and explain and understand how this kind of system can get going and keep itself going. So what he thinks is theories of, for example, autocatalytic networks can help demystify the thing that Kant found so mysterious, right? This holism. Now, again, what's missing from just the simple autocatalytic set is that the parts need to be trying to keep the whole together. So if we want to say that leaves are for making trees, what we want in order to make that true is not that just they happen to make trees, but that they seem very finely tuned to make a tree, right? So this is again the example of the bird with hollow bones. It could have been a whole bunch of other ways. The construction of a bird's overall body could have been a million other ways. Why is it this way in particular? Well, if it's that exact way that happens to satisfy its goals of surviving and reproducing, say, then that goal seems like a pretty good way of explaining why the parts are the way they are. And this kind of fine-tuning of the parts to keep the whole stable and the whole being organized to generate the parts does seem to be a feature of living things. So, a really important, and one last thing, Kaufman mentions here the sort of genetic determinism that he's trying to disagree with. So for a long time, the picture of living things was something like this. You've got some genes, and those genes are kind of like a program, a deterministic program that results in one and only one type of body. And that turns out to be not really true. I mean, there's not really any living thing that works that way. So, an important concept in modern biology is what's called phenotypic plasticity. So your phenotype is just the body that you've made for yourself, and it's plastic in the sense that it's changeable. So plasticity here doesn't mean you're made of plastic. It means you're flexible, you can change, you can be a bunch of different ways. So your phenotype, your body, can be a bunch of different ways. Phenotypic plasticity. So with identical genes, you can make a whole bunch of different bodies. Here's some plants, one of which is grown in low light and one of which is grown in high light. So lots of light versus not very much light. Two different environments make the plant behave very differently. Like the plant will grow differently. It'll have different strategies for making it in these different environments. And that seems to be a very general feature of living things. So every living thing seems to have quite a lot of phenotypic plasticity, right? A lot of different things that it can do with its genome. It's not that the genome programs you to be one way. What the genome does is afford you a whole variety of ways that you could build a body. And then your organism sort of selects one of those ways. From this huge spectrum of possibilities, the organism selects just one of them, and it's not a coincidence which one it picks. It's not just like it picks at random. Your organism selects amongst this huge variety of possibilities just one that's appropriate for the environment that you're in. So your genes are affording you building your body, but they don't tell you how to build your body. They don't say which body to build. They offer up a huge set of possibilities. And then our bodies do this amazing thing where they pick from amongst that huge set of possibilities one possibility which is adaptive, which is to say it's suited, it's fitted to the environment that you find yourself in. So this happens at all kinds of different levels, like the amount of muscle mass you have on your body depends on what you're asking it to do. So if you have more physical work to do in your life, your body makes more muscle, assuming you get the right preconditions. It adapts to the temperature that you're in. So if you're in a hot temperature, you sweat more. If you're in a cold temperature, you might shiver to kind of maintain homeostasis. There's just an unbelievable variety of different ways your body can respond to the environments that it's in. And if you want to understand why you've got the body that you do, you have to take into account the fact that it looks like the organism is tuning itself to the environment, which is to say, it's constructing its own parts. So you're in this autocatalytic network of parts making parts which make the first part. That autocatalytic network is behaving the way it does because of the overall holistic needs of the organism. So if you want to understand why, this plant on the left has way more leaves than the plant on the right. So why did the left plant make more leaf parts? If you want to understand that, then you have to know the environment that was in and the kind of way it's trying to adapt to that environment, right? So it's actively selecting amongst the possibilities afforded to it by its kind of molecular biology, by its genome, and by a bunch of other stuff that's available to it. It's trying to select amongst those possibilities the one that's best for the organism as a whole. This is the argument. So you've got this plasticity, and within that plasticity, these possibilities within that possibility set, The organism is using its possibilities in a way that it can make its own parts in an adaptive way. This is the argument. So D.M. Walsh, who wrote this paper on, or the reading for this week on functions, in 2006 wrote this other paper called Organisms as Natural Purposes, where he argues that if you want to know, so organisms have this large repertoire, he calls it, this repertoire of possibilities as possible responses to various environments. And if you want to know why the organism does what it does, that is, if you want to even know why it has the parts that it has, right? Why are the parts the way that, those specific parts, why are they behaving the way that they behave? You have to take into account that the organism is, in some sense, goal-directed towards that part of its repertoire that will keep it alive and keep it flourishing. So, on this way of seeing things, the goal-directedness of organisms helps to explain not just how they're organized overall, but why they've got the parts that they do, right? So, why are you making the amount of neurotransmitters that you're making? Why is your body doing biologically what it's doing? Why did it produce this enzyme rather than that enzyme? Why has it got this protein rather than that protein? So even at the molecular level, we want to understand why these parts are here, why they're organized the way they are. And if you don't know that they're there for the purpose of keeping you alive in that specific environment, then you've missed something important about how we're organized as living things. Notice that you don't need to do this for rocks. Like, if you understand why a rock has the parts that it does, you go through the geological history of the thing. There's no sense in which the rock is trying to adapt its own parts to be fitted to its environment so it can keep being a rock. So for rocks, you don't need these goal-based explanations. And in fact, for anything that's not alive, these goal-based explanations don't look like they're helpful at all. However, when we're talking about living things with a deep repertoire of possibilities that are selecting from amongst that repertoire just one possibility that just so happens to help keep it alive, it seems like you're missing some important part of the story if you don't mention that it's trying to stay alive. So this is his argument roughly, very roughly, but this is his argument roughly that we need teleological language. We need teleological concepts if we're gonna explain how living things work. And that we've got enough kind of quantitative modeling of how this works. You can do this in terms of sort of molecular biology and autocatalytic sets and self-organization, stuff like this. So I won't bore you with the details of this story, but the argument is there's enough respectable science about self-organization to allay Kant's worry that we're getting into the non-naturalistic world when we're talking about this stuff. So using the concept of adaptive self-organization, we can make goals scientifically respectable. And without goals, Walsh argues, you can't understand why living things have selected from amongst their vast repertoire just exactly the thing that they did select. Okay, so we started with what are we trying to do with function? We've got a choice to make. The concept of function can go one of two ways. We can either try to reduce it to non-teleological language. We try to get rid of this goal talk. Or we can roll with the goal talk. We can say, yes, goal talk is actually an important scientific concept. We were mistaken maybe it was okay to try to banish it from like physics and astronomy and cosmology and chemistry and all that stuff. But we shouldn't try to banish it from understanding living things. So that's the teleological, non-reductive approach to functional explanation. Okay, so the downside of this is that you have to sort of bite the bullet and accept that goals are real things, and maybe you don't want to do that. So there's the debate between some kind of, not completely satisfying reductive accounts of function. They all had their problems. And then this non-reductive account, which seems really good. It seems to capture everything important and interesting about our functional language, but you have to accept that goals are real things in the world, right? And that like plants have goals in some important sense, not just us who can imagine and represent to us ourselves what our goals are, but plants and bacteria and every living thing has goals, and their goal is to survive and flourish and reproduce or something like that. So you can pick amongst those options as you see best, as you see fit. Okay, so that's it for this time. We got one more lecture to do on the meaning of life, question mark. So I thought that kind of flowed nicely from talk about teleology and goal-directedness. That is, even supposing that all of my parts have goals, so my heart has a goal, my lungs have a goal, and my liver has a goal, do I have a goal? Is there some purpose or goal for me? And if there is such a thing, is it something that just I invent? Is it something that exists in the world? Can we talk meaningfully about the meaning of life? Okay, so that'll be our last lecture. Thanks.